My name's PeterKarn, Creative Director of Met Studio. So we're a museum, exhibition, experiential design company. We've been in business for over 30 years, designing exhibitions, museums and experiences internationally. What really drives us is this idea of connecting visitors with content. So part of what we do is to actually look at subjects and then think of innovative ways that we can actually communicate subjects to people, be it through buildings or through exhibitions or through interactives or through software or film. That's essentially what we do. We take the visitor, we take a story, and we connect those two things. I suppose the best way to start is how does it differ from another design project, because obviously you've got interior design project or architectural design or industrial design. I suppose it starts with a story, whereas a lot of other design practice would start with a pure design exercise. It would start by analysis of a space and visitor capacity and visitor flow and what materials are you going to use, what feel are you going to use for the space, what function do you want. Obviously we have to do all of that, but where we have to start is what story we're telling. So obviously we design exhibitions for lots and lots of different stories. The first thing is to get to the essence of that story, understand what's important in terms of doing that, because we're not regurgitating an encyclopedia of information. So we have to also understand our audience and analyse our audience, and then look at what elements of the story are relevant that we can actually put in bite-sized pieces or in terms of an overall narrative. And then from then start to look at actual physical design technique as to how we can reflect it. And lots of things come into play when we start to do that. Things in terms of budget, in terms of the constraints of the space, in terms of do we want to use technology or do we not, which budget affects, but also audience affects that. And where do you want to position your experience in relation to other experiences? Do you want it to be more about education, more about entertainment, or a mixture of the two? And what you want the lasting legacy of that to be. So there's a huge amount of factors that we need to consider above and beyond the physical design of the space. But I think it always starts with the story and the content and the narrative. And putting that into a tangible format is what really helps us when we design projects. And that's the first step. And it's quite a big step as well to overcome, which is why we work with content developers and script writers and researchers and collaborate with museum curatorial teams to actually overcome that step before we actually design anything. So we would start with an outline concept, a concept design for an exhibition, which would include an outline narrative. It would include some initial sketches or three-dimensional designs for the space. We start to look at some of the interactives and how they can start to work. We start to look at the graphic style, the look and feel, and we start to actually plan out schematically the exhibition. But that's and then we will need approval on that concept design before we move forward. So it's not completely fixed. There's still room for comment and creative development. We then move into the next stage, which is referred to as scheme design or developed design, depending on which regulation you're looking at. But what this is taking the concept design and actually fleshing it out more. So looking at more of the technologies that you're going to use, looking at cost plans, looking at physically how your graphics and your audio-visual fits in the space, actually fixing the plan layout of the space, so looking at more of the technical aspects of that. But then also doing the same with content, so actually developing the content in more detail, starting to look at the actual script, starting to look at the actual images that we're going to use and some of the film and picture reference. And then from that we move into what we call detailed design or final design or technical design, where we then start to look at nuts and bolts and material finishes and fittings, projection throws and technologies. So a very, very technical stage. We do some jobs where we actually have living environments, so we would start to look at actually the physical conditions that we need to create in terms of animal husbandry, access, maintenance, all of that kind of stuff, so that we can have a technical package that we can then give to contractors to bid for the work And then from there we would supervise a contractor who would be building it for, well, sometimes years and years, depending on the scale of the project. So it's a phased approach, so that we're not just going away designing something and going to a client as a product. We involve the client in each stage of the process so that they can always have sign-off on development, which is fundamental because the jobs we do are so complex. I think it depends on the project, obviously, and the nature of our work is very, very bespoke. If we're designing an expo pavilion, it's very, very different from designing a living environment or a gallery on the universe. But I think the first thing we need to do is understand from the client what the essence of what they're trying to portray is. Forget design, forget, oh, I want it to be this colour or this finish, because we've got lots and lots of time to do that, and that's what we do. We can show them a million options for that, and they just pick one. Where we need their guidance is they're the experts. This is their museum or their experience. They're going to take ownership of this thing. What do they actually want this thing to be? The details, they can come later, but it's more about the essence of a job. I think a lot of the time when we're maybe not briefed the way we should be is that we go too quickly into the details rather than sitting back and actually saying, forget all that, what's the spirit of this project? I think the best brief we've ever had was from Lego, where we took part in an international design competition for Lego a few years ago for a new brand centre in Billund, and it was a single sheet of A4 paper was the entire brief, and it literally just said, these are the things we want the job to achieve, now over to you guys. And then what they wanted from us is they wanted our response to also be a single sheet of paper. They wanted you to sum up your entire idea in a single piece of paper. It's as, I think it was it Thomas Hardy who said, I wish I could have written a shorter letter but I didn't have the time. I might be misquoted on that, but I think that's the essence of what we try and achieve, but also what our clients need to try and achieve for us is brevity and clarity, which is a very, very hard thing to achieve. But I think that's what we need from the outset, and then we can load in the detail from there, I think. I think you start with data. I mean, it's like you do a master plan. It's the same exercise. You start with raw data. You start with the big numbers. Okay, how many people do I want to get through this thing in a year, for example? What's our targets for that? And then, okay, so what does that mean our opening hours are? What does that mean how many a month, how many a week, how many a day, how many an hour? So what we can do is we can take those numbers and we can actually physically apply them to a space. So we can put in a certain amount of people in a space to say, okay, if you get groups of 40 through every 10 minutes, then you can have X amount of people through this every single hour, every single day, every single month, every single year. Does that meet your targets? And what that does is that actually dictates how we set out the exhibition. So, for example, if you're doing an expo pavilion, you want groups of 100 people going through this thing regularly, drip feeding through. And you need to get high numbers through it. So what that does is it means, okay, we can't put a huge amount of stuff on the walls, so we need to put it, on the floor, we need to put it on the walls, we need to put it above visitors' heads. Can they actually see over each other to see a show? Do we need to use a show at the start and the end to pulse visitors through? How do we avoid long queues? So it's sort of data and numbers like that really do affect what we design. Whereas on the other hand, if you're doing some permanent galleries, maybe you want to create a sense of isolation inside the gallery. So you don't want big open spaces, or you're working with a very, very small space, but you don't want people to know that they're in a small space. So you arrange the space in more of a meandering way so that you turn corners and you kind of weave through the space so that you create a different experience for the visitor. Of course, the ramifications of that is you can't get the same amount of people through. So I suppose it's a creative ideology as to what sort of experience you want to create versus how many people you want to get through this thing. And obviously we use pieces of software, AutoCAD and Vectorworks and 3D software, so we can map out the space and map the numbers of visitors going through the space. And you've got little things like interactives, obviously people are going to dwell at, so if you want a heavily interactive gallery, you have to allow enough circulation space so that you can counter for people dwelling in an interactive or people moving through. Whereas if you're doing a big show, you need to make sure you've got enough space for the show, enough visibility. So again, it very much depends on the nature of the job that we're designing. But you need to consider the solution you come up with versus practically how it works in the space. It's all very well just saying, yeah, we want a big show. But it's like, yeah, do you have enough ceiling height? Do you have enough width? Do you have enough time? Do you have enough capacity to be able to achieve that? And that's obviously something we work through with our clients. It comes from the very, very early discussion about where we sit with our client. We talk about, okay, what's this job going to be? You know, because it's what you can't do when you do an exhibition is arbitrarily select things. You know, it's not like your living room where you, well, I suppose in even your living room, it's not that's not the case. Where you can just say, oh, I want that chair, and I want that television, and I want that mirror, and I want that sofa. It needs to all flow from the essence of the subject, which is why that's so important to define. So, you know, if it's a heritage job, it needs to be sympathetic to heritage. You know, does it need to have a contemporary look and feel or a classical look and feel? It needs to have a DNA, I suppose, and it's setting that DNA early in terms of the story, but also in terms of the look and feel. So we would set a look and feel for the environment, but also a look and feel for the graphics and the media. So certain projects we have that are dealing with maybe subjects that maybe are a little bit more sensitive. We would obviously can't go into the Hollywood style 3D glasses and all this kind of stuff. You need to do something a little bit more subtle. But if you're doing something that's very much focused on entertainment and immersion, you can then use techniques that reflect that. So I think it's all about setting a look and feel that's relevant to the subject and that's appropriate to the tone of voice that you want to portray. And then your media selection is benchmarked against that. And it was also nice to look at the way people absorb information. At the moment, there's a big push for augmented reality. You know, it was virtual reality, now it's kind of moving into more the augmented sector. So just having a graphic panel, you don't need to do that. You can actually have very little, but then you can augment digital layers through phones and headsets and all this kind of stuff. So that's, I think the trends in the industry, I think, dictate a lot of that as well. And what we like to do as an agency is actually integrate a lot of things. So we don't necessarily like separate exhibits and separate displays that make it feel almost like an amusement arcade where you've got a machine over there, another one over there. We like to create environments that the messages actually come from. So when you walk up to a wall, something will happen. Or a wall is integrated with a floor that's integrated with a piece of furniture or with an audio-visual display, and they all come together to tell a holistic story. So I think it's all about that, but what I would say is it's not done in an arbitrary fashion. That's the most important thing, that it has to stem from the core idea of the subject and the exhibition. I think this is a thing that is so fundamental to a job, as fundamental as the initial inception of a project. Is you could design the greatest thing in the world, everything perfectly detailed and perfectly worked out, perfectly composed, but it's all on paper. The moment you actually build it, if you don't do it right, it's finished, it's curtains. So we have to go through a rigorous process to do it. As much as you think you may trust a contractor, or as much as you like the work that they've done in the past, you have to take them through the proper channels in terms of tendering a job. So what we do is making sure our documentation is as good as possible is also important. So setting the designer's scope to make sure that they're the designers, so my company are doing enough that the design intent is clearly communicated, and then actually tendering it to at least three, no fewer than three contractors, and then getting them to price based on what you've done, to actually be perfectly transparent in their pricing is important, to say what is included and what is not. But then also we like to actually interview all of our contractors, go and see their workshop facilities, listen to their ideas about the project, their suggestions, looking from our design, how would you do this or how would you do that, looking at their actual capabilities in terms of their in-house facilities, what they would sub out to subcontractors and what their policy on that is. A lot of factors involved. And then selecting one not just based on price. It's very easy just to go for the cheapest one, but based on their track record, based on their facilities and their capabilities to actually do the job. Because once the job opens, you know, and the curtain falls and everyone's drinking their champagne and everyone's looking at the project, no one's going to care how much the job costs. Then no one's going to care that, oh, that's not right because we went with a cheaper contractor. All they're going to care about is what they're looking at and is it good. So it's having the foresight to look beyond that. It's part of our job to do that, to guide our clients through that process. But it's absolutely fundamental to select the right contractor who's sympathetic to the needs of the project. Is very, very important. I mean, it varies from job to job because you get design and build contracts where you're actually the designer effectively is the contractor, so we can actually work with the contractor from the very beginning to make sure that we iron out any technical issues as we go through the job and don't have to go through a tender process. But our role primarily is supervision and art direction. So we would be there to effectively sense check the work that the contractor is doing. So we would look at their production drawings and then we would comment on them if they've missed anything or changed anything. And we would, with our client, sign off those drawings for production. We would then look at prototyping sessions, which when you're doing interactives and audio-visual experiences is very, very important. So we would get contractors to mock up interactives and audio-visual displays in their workshop so that we can test it and we can say, oh, you know, that's a bit low, or that needs to be brighter, or that needs to be louder. We can test the functionality of interactives, which can be quite complex. So we would do a round of prototyping so that everything's agreed, everyone's happy with any production and development, and then you give it the green light and then it goes to an install. And then at the install we would be present on site just to check the contractor's putting everything in the right place. There's always complications on site, especially if you're dealing with heritage buildings. The designer needs to be present to make certain decisions that will affect the design. So that's very, very fundamental that we have a presence on site, that you don't just leave it up to the contractor. So we can actually art direct on site. We would involve lighting designers and audiovisual designers to commission things on site so that things can be adjusted and perfectly aligned on site, which is very, very important. So yeah, we'd have quite a hands-on role. I mean, different designers do it in different ways, but I think all like to have a hands-on role after the job is designed and when it goes into production. But it does depend on our agreements with our clients. But we always advise our clients that we would like to supervise the job because it's in their interest and our interest to do it. That we have egos, maybe. I suppose it's quite difficult to come up with on the spot. I suppose it's the first one is what I've said before. It's think of the big picture, think of the big idea. Don't think about the details at the beginning because that's what you employ a designer to resolve with you through the process. So I think that's the point. It's more often than not that we get briefs that are incredibly complex. I received a brief the other day that was 670 pages long, brief. You know, and it's for us to read that and try and absorb what they want is very, very difficult. So what we always like to do is actually, if we can just sit down with the client and just tell me in a couple of minutes what the job's about, what's important on this project, what are you looking for. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing, I suppose, would be what's their preference on certain things. So do they want interaction or not? Do they want contemporary or do they want classical? So their kind of personal preference, I think. And I think that the third thing is always quite a good one, is what other experiences have you seen that you admire, that you aspire to? So what are your aspirations, I think, would be a third thing. Because I think what we don't really need to concern ourselves with at that stage is too much technical detail, because that's what you employ a designer to actually resolve. And I think more often than not when we pitch for projects, it's very, very difficult because we don't get an opportunity to ask those questions. Because we're in a competitive pitch scenario, we receive our 600-page brief, and then we have to come out the back end of it and present to a client, there it is, there's the answer. But of course, we can't get to that answer because we haven't been allowed to ask the right questions. We haven't had dialogue with our client. So I think a collaborative process is what we're after. So I think all three of those things are reflective of a collaborative process. So yeah, I think that would be my best answer, I think.
Awesome. PeterKarn, thank you.
Thank you very much.